This is too much. The rancher's voice cracked as he stared at the giant bride who had just stepped down from the wagon, wearing clothes that were little more than rags. For 6 long months he had dreamed of Violet, the shy, gentle girl from the photograph. Instead, here stood Ruby, fierce, unyielding, and built stronger than any man in the whole town. Boone Carter's plans for a quiet life, for a gentle marriage, all of it crumbled into dust right there on the main street of Willow Creek. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that this woman, Ruby, carried secrets. She carried enemies, and they were coming for him. She would force him to choose between the woman he thought he wanted and the woman destiny had just delivered to his door. The sun beat down on Willow Creek like the judgment of God himself. Boone's hands, usually steady enough to rope a wild steer, shook as he looked down at that little photograph, the daguerreotype. Soft brown curls, delicate hands folded just so, eyes that were too shy to meet the camera straight on. That was Violet McCall from Missouri, the girl who wrote him letters in a careful, flowing script. Letters about tending gardens and baking apple pies and reading the Bible on Sundays. The woman standing in front of him now could snap that photograph, and the man holding it in half without even breaking a sweat. Ruby towered over every single person in town. Her shoulders were broader than most doorways. The simple cotton shift she wore hung loose, but it couldn't hide the raw power coiled underneath. Her arms were as thick as fence posts. Her legs were planted wide, solid, like she owned every inch of ground she stood on. And she just might. Where Violet's letters spoke of needlework and quiet prayer, Ruby's green eyes held a lightning storm that made grown men take a step back. The whole trading post had gone quiet as a graveyard. You could hear a pin drop on the dusty floorboards. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, clutched her pearls so hard her knuckles went white. Doc Holloway took off his spectacles and cleaned them. Twice. Even Preacher Williams found a sudden, deep interest in the scuffs on his boot leather. "You expecting somebody else?" Ruby's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a winter wind. She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. "Name's Ruby McCall, not Violet." Ruby. The name hit Boone like a kick from his own mule. This woman filled up space in a way no woman he'd ever known did. She looked like she could stare down a twister and tell it to mind its manners. And the twister would listen. The way she looked at him, steady and measuring, sent a strange heat crawling up his neck. It wasn't shame. It was something else entirely. Something dangerous. "Where's Violet?" The words came out of his mouth rougher than Sunday whiskey. Ruby's jaw set, hard as granite. Plans changed. She hefted a worn leather satchel over her shoulder, easy as if it were a dinner pail. "We've got talking to do, you and I." Behind her, the wagon driver was unhitching his team with the frantic speed of a man escaping a fire. His eyes were fixed on anything and everything except Boone and the woman standing before him. A man in that much of a hurry to be gone meant one thing: trouble was following close behind. Boone Carter had learned that lesson the hard way, more than once. 6 months of letters, Boone said, his mind scrambling, trying to make the pieces fit where they wouldn't go. Wedding arrangements. We talked about our future, a life together. "The future's got a funny way of changing," Ruby said, her voice low, "especially when the past catches up." She took a step closer. Boone caught her scent. It wasn't the rose water Violet had written about. It was leather and wood smoke, honest sweat, and something else. Something wild and untamed he couldn't put a name to. "There are some things you need to hear," she said, her green eyes locking onto his. "Things that weren't mine to tell, until now." The weight in her voice made Boone's gut clench into a cold knot. This wasn't about a missed connection. This wasn't about a delayed stagecoach. Ruby was carrying something heavy, heavy as a millstone, and it showed in the way she held herself. Straight-backed, yes, but ready. Ready to run, or ready to fight. Folks were starting to gather now, like crows circling after a storm. Whispers started up, spreading faster than wildfire in dry grass. Boone could feel his good name, his reputation, cracking and splintering with every second that passed. 5 years. 5 years of honest dealing, of building trust, of making his name mean something in this territory. And it was all turning to dust while he stood there, gaping like a schoolboy who'd been caught stealing from the collection plate. "You comin' or not?" His voice had iron in it now. The same iron that made his ranch hands jump when there was work to be done. Ruby met his stare, and she didn't flinch. Not for a second. "That depends on how much truth you can stomach, Boone Carter," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying a challenge that was louder than a gunshot. "Because once I start talking, there ain't no going back. Not for either of us. Not to the life you thought you were fixing to have." The challenge hung in the air between them, thick and hazy as smoke from a grass fire. Boone studied this woman, this complete stranger who'd stepped off a wagon and turned his entire world sideways. 6 months. He'd spent 6 months dreaming of Gentle Violet, planning their quiet life. He'd fixed up the cabin, put in new store-bought curtains, even planted wildflowers by the door. All for a woman who wasn't here. Now, here stood Ruby, looking like she could handle herself in any fight that came her way, and probably had. And something about her, something fierce and unbroken, pulled at him in a way that scared him more than facing down a band of rustlers in the dead of night. The trading post was buzzing now. Every ear in Willow Creek was bent in their direction, soaking up the scandal like dry ground soaks up a summer rain. Ruby glanced at the circle of watching faces, then her gaze came back to him. "Too many folks listening in," she said, her voice low and tight. She gave a sharp nod toward his wagon, parked down the street. "Your place." The suggestion hit him wrong. Taking this woman, this Ruby, to his ranch, to the home he had so carefully prepared for his bride, it felt like crossing a line that had been carved in stone. It felt like a betrayal of a promise. But staying here, letting his business and his reputation get chewed over by every gossip in the territory, that felt a whole lot worse. "Mount up," he said, his voice clipped and final. He swung himself onto the wagon seat without looking back. Ruby moved with the easy grace of someone who'd been around horses her whole life. She pulled herself up beside him, smooth as silk, without any help. When she settled on the bench seat, Boone felt the heat of her presence like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. He was close enough now to see the tiny flecks of gold swimming in her green eyes, close enough to smell the scent of sage woven into her hair. They were sitting far enough apart that decent folks couldn't talk, but Lord help him, he wanted to close that distance. He wanted to know what it felt like to not have an inch of space between them. The ride out of town was silent. A heavy, crackling silence, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. Ruby sat proper and straight, her calloused hands resting steady in her lap, but her eyes never stopped moving. They swept the horizon, the hills, the gullies, like she was watching for something, or someone. Every few seconds their eyes would meet, and in that brief moment something would pass between them, something that had nothing to do with missing sisters or broken promises. It was something older, something raw, that made Boone's chest feel tight and his hands unsteady on the reins. His ranch sat nestled in a valley between rolling, sun-baked hills. The cabin was modest but solid, built with his own 2 hands to last through hard winters and even harder times. He'd spent weeks getting it ready for Violet. New curtains, yellow calico, a rocking chair he'd bought special for the porch, a fresh coat of whitewash on the fence. Everything a proper lady might want. Looking at it now, with Ruby sitting beside him, He felt like a fool for all that fussing. "You build this yourself?" Ruby asked, as he pulled the wagon up to the hitching post. Her voice was quiet, respectful. "Most of it." Boone climbed down, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He moved around the wagon to help her down. When he offered his hand, she paused for just a second, her eyes searching his face, before she took it. Her palm was warm and calloused against his, strong. When she stepped down from the wagon, she stood closer than was necessary, close enough that he could see the steady, frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat, close enough to feel like he was drowning in those stormy green eyes. "It's good work," she said, and the way she said it, the tone of her voice, suggested she was talking about more than just the carpentry. They stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting in his. Both of them seemed to realize at the same time that this simple touch felt more intimate, more real, than it ever should between two strangers. Ruby pulled her hand away first, but not before Boone saw a faint flush of color creep up her neck. "We should go inside," Boone said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Ruby just nodded. But as they walked toward the front door, the door he'd imagined carrying his bride through, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Before we do this," she said, turning to face him fully. The afternoon sun caught fire in her green eyes, making them blaze. "Before I tell you everything, you need to understand something." He waited. "After today, after you hear what I have to say, you're going to see me different. You're going to see everything different." "Maybe that ain't such a bad thing," Boone heard himself say. The words just slipped out, uninvited, from some part of him he didn't know existed. Ruby's eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. Surprise. For the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon and sent his world spinning, she looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "You don't know what you're saying." "Don't I?" Boone took a step closer, drawn in by a force he couldn't name and couldn't fight. "Maybe I'm tired of living a life built on pretty words and letters and a faded picture. Maybe I want something real." The moment stretched out between them, pulled taut like a rope, humming with possibility and crackling with danger. Both at the same time. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the softness in Ruby's face was gone. Her expression hardened into a mask of stone. She took a step back, putting distance between them again. "Be careful what you wish for, Boone Carter," she said, her voice now barely a whisper, but sharp as a shard of broken glass. "Because what I'm fixing to tell you, it involves blood and betrayal and secrets that could destroy everything you think you know about the woman you were planning to marry." Inside the ranch house, the air was still and quiet. Ruby moved through the main room like a ghost, her eyes cataloging every detail. The hand-carved furniture, the stone fireplace he'd built himself, the small kitchen table set for two, with the matching plates he'd ordered special all the way from Denver. Boone watched her, watched the way her fingers trailed along the back of the chair he had intended for his wife. For Violet. "You really thought this all through," she said, and her voice held a strange mix of admiration and something else, something that sounded a lot like regret. "I'm a practical man," Boone replied, though standing here with Ruby instead of the girl from the photograph made him question every practical decision he had ever made in his entire life. "I believed in the arrangement we made." Ruby turned to face him then. In the softer, dimmer light of the house, he could see the bone-deep exhaustion she'd been hiding outside. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. There was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and hard, impossible choices. "Violet never wanted to marry you," she said. The words were quiet, but they hit Boone like a physical blow. Not from the beginning. He kept his face a mask of stone. A man learned early on to take hard news standing up. Then why agree? Why the letters, the arrangements? Because she was desperate. Ruby sank into one of the chairs by the table, the one meant for Violet, and suddenly she looked older than her years, worn down. And because I convinced her it was the only way out. Boone felt the floor tilt beneath his feet again. You convinced her? Ruby's hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. Our pa died last winter, left us with nothing but debts. Debts that would have taken everything. The farm, the house, everything our family had built over 3 generations. Her voice was tight with grief and anger. Violet was only 17. She was scared out of her mind. And She paused, swallowing hard, fighting for control. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could find her a good, honest man, someone who would take care of her proper. So you wrote the letters? The understanding was dawning now, cold and bitter in Boone's chest. I wrote them. Ruby finally looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I arranged everything. Violet knew about it, of course, but the words, the promises, the woman you thought you were getting to know, she didn't have to finish. He knew. That was me. Boone turned away. He walked to the window, staring out at the rolling hills of his ranch, needing the distance to process what she was telling him. The woman he'd fallen for, the gentle soul who'd shared her thoughts on books and her dreams for their future. None of it was real. He had fallen in love with a ghost, a phantom made of ink and paper. He had fallen in love with Ruby. Where is she now? He asked, his back still to her, his voice flat. The silence stretched on, so long and heavy that Boone finally turned around. Ruby was staring down at her own hands, as if she couldn't bear to look at him. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. 3 days ago, a man came to our boarding house, back in Kansas City. She took a shaky breath. Someone from her past, someone she thought she'd never have to see again. She stopped, swallowing hard again. He told her things about you, Boone. Terrible things. Things that made her believe you weren't the man I'd convinced her you were. What things? Boone's voice was sharp now, cutting through the thick tension in the room. Ruby finally met his eyes, and what he saw there was pure, raw fear. But it wasn't fear of him. It was fear of what she was about to tell him. He said you were already married. Her voice trembled. That you collect wives through the mail, and then you sell them. To men in the mining camps when you get tired of them. A hot, white rage started building in Boone's chest. It was so absurd, so vile, he almost laughed. But before he could speak, Ruby rushed on, her words tumbling out. He had documents, photographs. He had proof that looked real enough to terrify a 17-year-old girl who's never been more than 20 miles from home in her life. Her voice dropped to a whisper. So she ran. She ran with him. The pieces were falling into place now, jagged and ugly, painting a picture that made Boone's blood run cold. And I came here, Ruby said, getting to her feet, her hands shaking slightly at her sides. I came here to warn you, because whoever that man is, whatever he wants from you, this isn't over. She took a step toward him, her green eyes wide with a desperate urgency. He knows about you, Boone. He knows about this ranch. He knows about the arrangements we made. Her voice cracked. And I think we're both in terrible danger. Boone stared at Ruby, his mind racing, trying to process her words. The idea that someone would go to such elaborate lengths just to destroy his reputation seemed impossible. It was the work of a madman. Yet the genuine terror in her eyes told him she believed every single word of it. What did this man look like? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. He moved closer to her, his anger now a cold, hard thing in his gut. Tall, well-dressed. Ruby wrapped her arms around herself as if a sudden chill had swept through the room. He had gray hair at the temples, but a young face. He spoke like an educated man. carried himself like someone who was used to getting his own way. She shuddered. But his eyes, they were cold, like he enjoyed delivering bad news, like he enjoyed watching people suffer. Something about that description tugged at the edges of Boone's memory, a half-forgotten ghost from a life he thought he'd left behind. Did he give a name? Marcus Dalton. The name hit Boone like a physical punch to the gut. Marcus Dalton. Images flashed through his mind, sharp and unwelcome. A business partnership that had gone sour, vicious accusations of theft, a good man's reputation destroyed by whispers and expertly forged documents. Boone had thought that chapter of his life was buried deep in the dirt of Colorado. Ruby saw the flash of recognition on his face instantly. "You know him?" "I knew him," Boone said, his voice grim. 3 years ago, back in Colorado, we were partners in a freight business. He ran a hand through his hair, the anger building again, hot and righteous. Until I caught him skimming money from our clients. When I confronted him, he turned it all around. He made it look like I was the thief. By the time I managed to prove my innocence, he had disappeared, vanished with half our assets, and left me with a reputation in ruins. So the documents he showed Violet, they were fake. Just like before, Ruby said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Probably, Boone growled, but convincing enough to fool a scared young woman who wanted to believe the worst. He paced the small room, feeling like a caged animal. The question is, how in the hell did he find me here? And why now? After all this time? Ruby walked to the window, staring out, but seeing nothing. "There's something else," she said, her back to him. "When Violet left with him, she took something. A letter. It was a letter that came for you last week. I found it slipped under our door with your name on it." "What letter?" "I haven't received any mail except for your correspondence." "I don't know what was in it," she said, turning back to face him. "She hid it from me. But I saw her reading it, over and over. Her face was white as a sheet. Whatever it said, it scared her even more than Dalton's lies." Boone felt the pieces of a much larger, darker puzzle clicking into place, but the picture they were forming made no sense at all. "Ruby, I need you to think," he said, his voice urgent. "Think carefully. Was there anything else Dalton said? Anything at all that seemed strange or out of place?" Ruby turned back from the window. In the fading afternoon light, her face was pale, but etched with a fierce determination. He knew things, Boone. Private things. What kind of things? Things about this ranch, about your plans to expand your herd, to start trading cattle east. He knew about the money you've been saving. He knew about the contracts you're negotiating with buyers back in Chicago. That information wasn't public knowledge, not by a long shot. Boone had shared those very specific plans with exactly 3 people, his banker in Cheyenne, his lawyer, and Sheriff Morrison, he said quietly, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Ruby's eyes widened. "What about him?" "He's the only other person who knows about those contracts, the only one here in Willow Creek. We discussed them last month when he helped me with some legal paperwork for the land." The pieces were no longer just falling into place. They were slamming together like cards in a rigged deck. "If Dalton knows those details," Ruby said, the horrifying realization dawning in her eyes, "then either he's been watching you for a very long time." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "Or someone you trust has been feeding him information." The implications of her words settled over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. If Ruby was right, then Dalton's sudden appearance wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just about old revenge. It was part of a cold, calculated plan that had been months, maybe even years in the making. And as if summoned by their very conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Faint at first, then growing louder, closer. Both of them moved to the window as one. In the distance, they could see them. 3 riders, approaching the ranch at a steady, purposeful pace. You expecting company? Ruby asked, her voice tight with a new kind of tension. Boone shook his head, his hand instinctively moving toward the big Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace. Not at this hour. The riders were still too far away to be identified, but there was something about the way they rode, methodical and confident, that made the hairs on Boone's arms stand on end. Whatever game Marcus Dalton was playing, whatever twisted plan he had set in motion, it looked like the next move was about to be made. Right here, on his doorstep. Ruby, Boone said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. Whatever happens next, I need you to know something. I never would have hurt Violet, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Ruby moved closer to him, so close he could feel the warmth of her body against his arm. I know, she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. I've known since the moment I first laid eyes on you. The three riders drew closer, cresting the last hill before the ranch house, and in the golden light of the setting sun, Boone's blood ran cold. He recognized the lead horse, a distinctive black mare with 4 white stockings. He'd seen that horse every week for the past 5 years, tied up outside the trading post while its owner conducted business in town. That's Sheriff Morrison, Boone said, his voice flat and dead with disbelief. Ruby tensed beside him, a coiled spring of muscle and nerve. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Before Boone could answer, the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust in front of the house. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered face grim and unreadable in the fading daylight. The 2 men with him stayed on their horses, their hands resting casually, almost lazily, near their sidearms. It was a detail that wasn't lost on Boone for a second. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. This was the man who'd welcomed him to the territory, the man who'd helped him file his claim and establish his ranch, the man who'd shared Sunday dinners at this very table. Now he was here, with armed men, and Boone knew with a cold, sinking certainty that this was not a social call. In the dim light of the doorway, Ruby's hand found his, her strong fingers intertwined with his, a silent promise. Whatever was coming through that door, they would face it together. Evening, Boone. Morrison's voice boomed across the yard, carrying the heavy weight of official business, the kind of tone that made honest men nervous and guilty men run for the hills. Need to have a word with you. Boone stepped out onto the porch, Ruby a solid presence right behind him. The cool evening air carried the clean scent of sage and approaching rain, but underneath it all, he could taste it, the sharp, metallic tang of danger. Any man who'd lived through hard times could recognize it in a heartbeat. What's this about, Sheriff? Boone kept his voice level, calm, though his hand itched for the feel of the rifle just inside the door. Morrison's eyes shifted just for a second to Ruby. Something unreadable, something complex, passed across his weathered face. It looked like cold calculation mixed with a flicker of what might have been regret. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside, he said, his voice hard. This is between me and Mr. Carter here. She stays, Boone said firmly, his voice ringing with finality. He felt Ruby's hand briefly touch the small of his back, a silent thank you. Morrison's jaw tightened, like a man biting down on something bitter. Suit yourself. Boone, I've got a warrant here for your arrest. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. The legal document crackled ominously in the evening breeze. Charges of fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The words hit like physical blows, one after another, but Boone had learned a long, long time ago never to show weakness when you're cornered. That's impossible. It's a lie. Got a sworn complaint, Morrison said, his eyes as cold as a mountain stream. Filed this morning by a Mr. Marcus Dalton. Says you've been running a scheme, luring innocent young women out to this territory under false pretenses. His eyes flicked to Ruby again. He claims you've got a missing girl named Violet McCall held here against her will. Says her family's worried sick. Ruby stepped forward then, her chin held high, her eyes blazing with the defiance of a woman who had fought for everything she'd ever had. I'm Violet's sister, and she is not missing. She left of her own free will. That's not what Mr. Dalton says, ma'am. Morrison's tone carried the careful, practiced neutrality of a man who was just following orders he didn't necessarily have to believe in. He's got witnesses. Witnesses who saw her being forced into a wagon against her will. Said she was crying, begging for help. The rage in Boone's chest was a physical thing now, a pressure building like steam in a boiler. Dalton is lying. He's the one who took her. He filled her head with poison, with false stories about me. Maybe so, Morrison said, but his tone, his flat, empty eyes, told Boone he didn't believe a word of it. That'll be for a judge to sort out. Right now, I just need you to come with me, peaceful-like. One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle. As he did, his coat fell open, and Boone saw it, a glint of metal pinned to his vest. Not a local deputy's star. It was a federal badge. This wasn't just about local charges anymore. This was bigger. Someone with real power, real influence, wanted him gone. Sheriff, Ruby's voice cut through the tension, steady as a rock despite the impossible circumstances. What if I told you that I could prove Marcus Dalton is the one who's lying? What if I told you I have evidence that he's been planning this for months? Morrison's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker, but Boone caught it, the brief, almost imperceptible glance he exchanged with the federal marshal. It was a look that spoke of prior conversations, of plans already set in motion long before they ever rode out to this ranch. Ma'am, I appreciate you wanting to help your friend here, Morrison said, his voice condescending. But we've got to follow proper procedures. Evidence gets presented in a courtroom, not on a man's front porch. The way he said it, the careful, detached tone that didn't match the man who'd shared his whiskey and his table. That told Boone everything he needed to know. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about proper procedures. This was about following orders. Orders from someone with enough money and influence to buy federal badges and corrupt local sheriffs. Sheriff Morrison and I go back 5 years, Boone said quietly, his voice dangerously low. He never took his eyes off the man he had once foolishly called a friend. He's the one who helped me get established here. He's the one who knew about all my business plans, my financial arrangements. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. My correspondence with Violet McCall. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. In that one heart-stopping moment, Ruby understood exactly what Boone was telling her. Sheriff Morrison hadn't just been a friend. He'd been a spy. He'd been feeding information to Marcus Dalton all along. And now, they were both trapped in a web that had been months in the weaving. Morrison's hand moved slowly, almost instinctively, toward the butt of his gun. But he stopped when Ruby took another step forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a cavalry saber. Sheriff, she said, her eyes locked on his. Before you make a mistake you can't take back, you should know that Marcus Dalton isn't the only one who's been watching people. She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. Morrison's eyes narrowed. What kind of watching? The kind that shows exactly when you started meeting Mr. Dalton at the Silver Dollar Hotel in town, she said, her voice ringing with cold confidence. The kind that details your conversations about Boone's cattle contracts, his routines, his financial dealings. Ruby's voice was steady as a surgeon's hand, but Boone could see the faint trembling in her fingers. It wasn't fear. It was fury. 3 months of meetings, Sheriff. All of them documented right here. Dates, times, topics of conversation. The federal marshal shifted in his saddle again, his posture no longer casual. He was suddenly very, very interested. "That true, Morrison?" "She's lying." Morrison spat, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the desperate denial of a guilty man. Desperate people say desperate things when they're cornered. Ruby didn't even flinch. She opened the journal and began to read, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent yard. March 15th. Morrison met Dalton at the Silver Dollar Hotel, second floor, room 12. They discussed Boone Carter's cattle contracts and his plans to expand his business eastward. She looked up, her gaze pinning Morrison to the spot. His face was growing pale under his weathered tan. March 22nd. Another meeting, same location. This time, they talked about the correspondence with Violet McCall. They discussed how to use it against him. Boone watched Morrison's confidence crack and shatter like thin ice under a hot sun. The sheriff's hand was now resting on the grip of his pistol, but his certainty, his authority, was crumbling with every word Ruby spoke. "How could you possibly know that?" Morrison demanded, his voice strained. Beads of sweat were popping up on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. "Because I was there," Ruby said simply. And the matter-of-fact way she said it made it ring with the undeniable truth. "I was working in the hotel kitchen, trying to earn some extra money for Violet and me before the wedding." A cold, bitter smile touched her lips. "It's amazing how much you can overhear when people think you're invisible." The federal marshal was watching the exchange now with the sharp, predatory interest of a lawman who suddenly realizes he's been played for a fool. His hand was now conspicuously far away from his weapon. "Morrison," the marshal said, his voice flat and cold, "you want to try and explain this?" "It's all lies," Morrison insisted, but the words came out weak, strangled. "Dalton is a respected businessman. He came to me with legitimate concerns about Carter here." "A respected businessman?" Ruby repeated, and her voice was dripping with a contempt so pure it could have frozen hellfire. "Is that what you call a man who forges documents and terrorizes young women? Because I have witnesses, Sheriff. Witnesses who saw him threaten my sister. Witnesses who saw him show her photographs of other women he claimed Boone had hurt." "What photographs?" Boone said sharply, a new cold dread settling in his stomach. Ruby turned to him, her expression as grim as a winter storm. "Pictures of women. Women who were bruised and crying. He told Violet they were all your previous wives. All victims of your wicked schemes." Her voice dropped, thick with anger. "But I recognized one of them, Boone. I recognized one of the women in those pictures. She works at the saloon back in Cedar Rapids. I saw her just last week, alive and well, and married to the blacksmith there." The final pieces clicked into place with the clean, deadly sound of a well-oiled revolver being cocked. Dalton hadn't just been planning to frame Boone. He had been building an elaborate, airtight case using completely fabricated evidence, with the corrupt local sheriff providing the credibility to make it all stick. The federal marshal was now fully focused on Morrison, his earlier certainty replaced by the cold fury of a lawman who had been used. "Sheriff," he said, his voice like chipping stone, "I'm going to need you to step down from your horse and explain yourself. Now." Morrison's face hardened, and in that one, split second, Boone saw the man make his choice. He wasn't going to jail. The sheriff's hand flew to his gun. He was fast, but before his gun could clear leather, Ruby did something that shocked everyone. She grabbed Boone's arm with surprising strength and yanked him hard to the side, just as Morrison's pistol roared. The shot went wide, shattering the window of the cabin behind them. And in the chaotic heartbeat that followed, as the second rider fought to control his spooked horse, Ruby pressed something small, hard, and metallic into Boone's hand. A small, brass key. "The barn," she whispered urgently, her voice a fierce hiss in his ear. "There's something hidden there, something you need to see, something Violet left behind for you." As the federal marshal wrestled a cursing Morrison to the ground, Boone realized the truth. Ruby hadn't been planning for this moment for just a few days. She had been planning for it all along. She hadn't just come to warn him about the danger. She had come prepared to give him the weapons to fight back. But what in God's name had Violet hidden in his barn? And how did Ruby know exactly where to find it? The evening air exploded into chaos. Morrison was cursing, the marshal was shouting orders, horses were stamping and snorting in panic. In the confusion, using the gathering darkness as their cover, Boone and Ruby slipped around the side of the house. "This way," Ruby whispered, her voice tight. She led him, not toward the open range, but toward the large, dark silhouette of his own barn. Her hand found his in the gloom, and despite the gunshots and the shouting, Boone was struck by how natural it felt, how right it seemed to be moving through this danger with this impossible woman by his side. "Ruby, how did you know?" he asked as they reached the heavy wooden doors. "How did you know about whatever's in there?" She paused, her face a pale oval in the faint moonlight. "Because I've been here before." The admission hit him like a bucket of cold water. "When?" 2 weeks ago. Violet. She insisted on seeing the place where she was supposed to spend the rest of her life. "We rode out here one afternoon while you were in town buying supplies." Ruby's voice was barely audible over the distant sounds of the struggle. "She was going to leave you a letter. Something to explain why she couldn't go through with the marriage, to tell you it wasn't your fault." "What happened?" "We got here, and she saw the place. She saw the new curtains in the window, the flowers you planted by the door. She saw how much care you'd put into preparing for her." Ruby held up the small brass key. It glinted in the moonlight. "She couldn't leave the letter after that, so she hid this instead, just in case something went wrong, in case she needed you to have proof of what really happened." They slipped inside the barn. The familiar, comforting smell of hay and old leather surrounded them, but tonight everything felt different, charged with secrets, heavy with the weight of a truth that was about to be revealed. Boone lit a lantern with hands that were not quite steady. The warm light pushed back the shadows. Ruby moved with a strange purpose, heading toward the back corner where he stored his saddles and winter gear. She moved like she had walked this exact path in her mind 100 times. "Here," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. She knelt beside a large, iron-banded trunk he used for storing old blankets and tools. The key she held fit perfectly into a small, ornate lock he had never even noticed before, cleverly hidden beneath a piece of the iron reinforcement. With a soft click, the lock opened. Inside the trunk, nestled beneath old wool blankets that smelled of mothballs and forgotten memories, was a wooden box, a polished mahogany box that did not belong to him. Ruby lifted it out carefully, as if it were a holy relic. She placed it on the dirt floor and opened the lid. Boone's breath caught in his throat. Letters, dozens and dozens of them, all in different, unfamiliar handwriting, all of them addressed to one man, Marcus Dalton. And underneath the letters was a thick stack of photographs that made Boone's stomach turn over. Images of women with bruised faces and terrified, haunted eyes. The same ones, he realized with a jolt, that Dalton had used to terrorize Violet. "These are the real pictures," Ruby said, her voice hollow, stripped of all emotion. "The ones he uses to blackmail people." She pointed a trembling finger at the letters. "Look at the names." Boone picked up the letters with shaking hands. His heart sank, a cold, heavy stone in his chest, with each new name he recognized. Sheriff Morrison's name was on several of them, detailing payments made and favors granted. A territorial judge he knew by reputation. The mayor of Cedar Rapids, a powerful railroad executive, all of them compromised, all of them caught in Dalton's web, dancing to his tune. "He's been running this scheme for years," Boone breathed, the full, sickening scope of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about power, marriage fraud, blackmail, corruption on a scale he could barely imagine, and maybe something much, much worse. Ruby nodded, tears finally glistening in her eyes, shining like dewdrops on morning grass in the lantern light. Violet found all of this. It was hidden in Dalton's hotel room. She found it when she went to confront him about the lies he was telling about you. So that's why she ran, Boone said, the pieces fitting together. Not because she believed his stories about me, but because she realized how truly dangerous he was. Then why didn't she come to me? The question was a raw ache in his throat. Why run away with him? Ruby's face crumpled. Months of terror and guilt and secrets finally came pouring out, like water through a broken dam. Because he has more than just photographs, Boone, she choked out. He has her younger brother. The world stopped spinning. All the air was sucked from Boone's lungs, leaving him gasping in a silent void where nothing made sense anymore. What? Thomas? He's just a boy. He's only 14. Ruby was sobbing now, great, racking sobs that shook her strong shoulders. The weight of carrying this terrible secret alone had finally broken her. Dalton took him. He took him 3 days before I was supposed to leave for the wedding. He told Violet he would kill the boy if she didn't cooperate, if she didn't help him destroy you. The final, horrifying truth fell into place with sickening clarity. Violet wasn't a willing accomplice. She was a prisoner. She was being forced to play her part in this monstrous charade to save her little brother's life. And Ruby? Ruby had come here not just to warn him. She had come here to find an ally. An ally in a desperate fight she knew she couldn't possibly win alone. She's not running away with him, Ruby whispered through her tears, her face buried in her hands. She's just trying to keep Thomas alive. Outside, they could hear the federal marshal shouting orders, the sounds of horses moving, of Morrison being secured. But inside the barn, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, Boone and Ruby sat in the quiet eye of a storm that was far from over. The real fight had only just begun. Where did they go? Boone asked. His voice was deadly calm, the kind of quiet that made dangerous men nervous. Ruby wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand and grabbed one of the letters from the open box. Violet managed to slip me a note before they left, a tiny scrap of paper. She overheard Dalton talking. A place called Miller's Canyon. It's about 20 miles north of here. Her eyes met his, wide and desperate. He has a cabin there, an old trapper's cabin. It's where he takes people, when he wants them to disappear. Boone knew the place. It was rugged, isolated country. Federal territory with no local law, no jurisdiction. The perfect place for a man like Dalton to operate without any interference. But it was also a fortress. Isolated, easily defensible. The kind of place where a rescue attempt could turn into a massacre if it wasn't handled with perfect precision. The barn door creaked open, and the federal marshal stepped inside, his face grim in the lantern light, but his weapon was holstered. Behind him, they could see Morrison, bound and sitting slumped against a tree, his career and his reputation in ruins. Marshal Chen, Boone said, standing up slowly. I think you need to see this. Marshal Chen examined the letters and the photographs with a growing, silent amazement. His expression darkened with each new piece of evidence, each new name of a compromised official. This changes everything. If Dalton has been blackmailing federal judges, manipulating railroad land rights... He looked up at Boone, his eyes hard and clear. The charges against you are hereby dropped, Mr. Carter, but we need to move fast if we're going to save those hostages. I'm going with you, Boone said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. And me, Ruby added, her voice strong again, brooking no argument, despite the tear tracks still wet on her cheeks. Marshal Chen shook his head. Ma'am, with all due respect, this is going to be extremely dangerous. We don't know how many men Dalton has with him, or what kind of defenses he set up at that cabin. "Marshal," Ruby said, stepping forward into the light, "I am the only person here who has seen his operation up close. I know his routines, his habits. I know where he is likely to keep his prisoners." Her eyes blazed with a determination that could have melted steel. "Besides, my sister trusts me. If you want her cooperation during the rescue, if you want to get them out of there alive, you need me there." Boone felt something shift in his chest as he watched Ruby stand her ground against federal authority. This woman, this incredible woman who had traveled across dangerous territory to warn a stranger, who had risked everything to expose a vast conspiracy, who was now volunteering to ride straight into the jaws of death to save her sister and her brother. "She's right," Boone told the marshal. "We need her." Marshal Chen studied them both for a long, silent moment, weighing the risks against the cold, hard reality of what they were facing. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "We leave at first light. Morrison here is going to tell us everything he knows about Dalton's setup, or he'll be facing federal charges for conspiracy and kidnapping on top of everything else." As they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars, Boone found himself standing close to Ruby in the darkness outside the barn. The night air was cool against his skin, filled with the promise of rain and the distant, lonely sound of coyotes calling to the moon. "Ruby," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "after this is over, after we bring Violet and Thomas home safe." He paused, searching for the right words, for words that could possibly carry the weight of everything he was feeling. "I need you to know that what's been growing between us, it's real. It's not about letters or arrangements or anything except you." Ruby turned toward him. In the soft moonlight, her face was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with courage and strength and a heart that refused to be broken. "I know," she whispered, and a small, brave smile touched her lips. "I feel it too." The rescue at Miller's Canyon was swift and brutal. Marshal Chen's federal authority, combined with Ruby's inside knowledge and Boone's raw, focused determination, proved to be too much for Dalton's small band of hired guns. When the shooting stopped and the smoke finally cleared, Marcus Dalton lay dead in the dust, his network of corruption and terror exposed to the harsh light of day at last. 6 months later, Boone stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching Ruby tend the small garden she'd planted behind the house. Violets, he noticed, were growing strong near the fence. Violet herself had married a kind young teacher back in Cedar Rapids and was expecting her first child. Thomas, safe and sound, was thriving on the ranch, learning from Boone how to be the kind of man his father would have been proud of. The powerful railroad company, without Dalton's corrupt influence pulling their strings, had eventually decided to build their new route around Boone's land, not through it. Honest negotiations had prevailed. "Mrs. Carter," Boone called out, still loving the sound of her new name, even after all these months. Ruby straightened up, her hand resting protectively over her own growing belly. She turned and smiled at the man who had, against all odds, become her entire world. What had started as deception and desperate circumstances had grown into something real, something lasting. Something that proved that the best and truest things in life sometimes come disguised as the worst mistakes. As they walked into their home together, hand in hand, Ruby reflected on how far they had all come. The wrong sister may have stepped off that wagon 6 months ago, but she had stepped into exactly the right life. And that, friends, is how sometimes the biggest, most unexpected surprises can turn into our greatest blessings. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Because stories like these, stories about real love finding its way through impossible circumstances, are what this channel is all about. Your support helps us keep bringing you tales of courage, love, and the kind of justice that still mattered when the West was wild and a man's word was his bond. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places.